Marlon Brando and Marilyn Monroe, Hollywood's darkest secret. The passionate relationship between two of Hollywood's greatest legends remained secret for years. Before his death, Marlon Brando made a bombshell confession in his published autobiography. What happened between him and Marilyn Monroe was far more than just a friendship. But what lay behind the chemistry between these two iconic figures, and what was really discussed in that mysterious phone call Monroe made to Brando just weeks before her tragic death. Today, we examine one of Hollywood's best-kept secrets through Brando's own confessions. But before we begin, if you're curious about Hollywood's dark history, the unknown stories of celebrities, and the greatest secrets of the cinema world, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to tell you today is full of truths that have been hidden for years and are only now coming to light. The first meeting. A cold winter night in 1955. On the dark streets of New York, just behind Broadway's glittering world, two people met quietly. One was the world's most desired woman, the other cinema history's most talented actor, Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando. That night, after a party at Lee Strasberg's Actors Studio, the two truly spoke for the first time. Monroe admired Brando's acting. Brando was one of the rare people who noticed that Monroe, contrary to what everyone saw, possessed deep intelligence and fragility. However, what began that night was neither simple admiration nor an ordinary flirtation. The bond that formed between them would become one of Hollywood's darkest secrets. In his 2004 autobiography, Songs My Mother Taught Me, Brando wrote about Monroe. Marilyn called me one night and said she just wanted to talk. We talked for hours. She wasn't the naive fool everyone thought she was. On the contrary, she had a sharp intelligence, but Hollywood had turned her into a commodity. These lines may seem simple, but few people know that what Brando wrote about Monroe was just the tip of the iceberg. Because Brando didn't include his most intimate memories and deepest secrets in his autobiography, he told them only to his closest friends, and when these friends broke their silence years later, the emerging picture was shocking. Their backgrounds. Marlon Brando was born in Nebraska in 1924. His father was an alcoholic who constantly fought with his mother. Brando witnessed domestic violence in childhood, and this trauma affected his entire life. When he came to New York, he took acting lessons from Stella Adler and quickly made a name for himself on Broadway stages. When he played Stanley Kowalski in Tennessee Williams's A Streetcar Named Desire in 1947, he was only 23 years old, but his performance was so powerful that it changed the face of American theater. Brando used a technique called method acting, completely immersing himself in his roles and living his characters from within. This was revolutionary for that era. When he reprised the same role in the 1951 film version of A Streetcar Named Desire, he became one of Hollywood's brightest stars. With subsequent films like The Wild One, On the Waterfront, and Julius Caesar, Brando became not just an actor, but a cultural icon. However, behind his success lay deep loneliness and dissatisfaction. Brando hated Hollywood's fake world, people smiling to your face, then talking behind your back, studios using actors like commodities, and the press constantly intruding on private lives. At this point, his paths crossed with Marilyn Monroe, and the two found something unexpected in each other: authenticity. Marilyn Monroe was born in Los Angeles in 1926 as Norma Jean Mortensen. When her mother was admitted to a mental hospital, little Norma Jean grew up in orphanages and foster homes. She told her therapist years later that she had been sexually abused as a child, though she rarely spoke about it. When she married at 16, she just wanted to escape an orphanage. But the marriage didn't last long, and the young girl found herself working in a factory. There, a photographer discovered her, and her life changed. First a model, then an actress. When she changed her name to Marilyn Monroe, she left her identity completely behind, or so it seemed. By the mid-1950s, Monroe had become one of Hollywood's most famous stars. With films like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, How to Marry a Millionaire, and The 7-Year Itch, she graced millions of people's dreams. However, Monroe wanted to prove herself as a serious actress. She was tired of being labeled a sex symbol and uncomfortable with Hollywood seeing her as just a pretty face. That's why she came to New York and joined the Actors Studio. There she wanted to learn real acting, and there she met Marlon Brando. The secret relationship. According to many sources, their first encounter was at a party in 1955. However, some close friends say the two had met before but truly spoke that night. Monroe asked Brando questions about his acting. Brando was surprised that Monroe's questions were intelligent and that she genuinely wanted to learn, because in Hollywood, everyone treated Monroe like she was stupid. But Brando was different. He saw the real person behind Monroe's mask. After that night, the two began meeting frequently. What initially seemed like a friendly relationship quickly went deeper. Carlo Fiore, Brando's close friend, said in an interview years later, Marlon was different when talking about Marilyn. He genuinely cared about her. It wasn't just a physical thing between them. Marilyn showed Marlon the side of herself that no one else saw, and Marlon did the same for her. Both were people who had been deeply wounded in childhood, and they understood each other's pain. These statements show that the relationship was not just an affair, but a deeper connection. But why did this relationship remain secret? There were several reasons. First, Monroe was married at the time. She had married baseball legend Joe DiMaggio in 1954, but the marriage lasted only 9 months. After the divorce, she began a relationship with playwright Arthur Miller and married him in 1956. Brando never believed in long-term monogamous relationships. Throughout his life he was with countless women and married 3 times, but none of his marriages ended happily. Second, both were thinking about their careers. At that time, scandals could end an actor's career, and studios controlled actors with morality clauses. Third, and perhaps most importantly, both wanted to keep this relationship private, because the bond between them was a genuine connection, outside Hollywood's fake world. The deep connection. There is very little information about the time Brando and Monroe spent together, because both kept these moments secret and avoided photographers. However, some witnesses say the two met in a small apartment in Manhattan. Ellen Adler, a friend of Brando's, noted that Monroe frequently called Brando, and they talked for hours on the phone. What was discussed in these conversations is not exactly known, but we can glean some clues from Brando's autobiography. In his autobiography, Brando wrote that Monroe talked about her childhood and the traumas she experienced. Monroe had confessed that she feared her mother's mental illness and worried that she too would go crazy one day. She also talked about how Hollywood used and exploited her. She said she had been sexually harassed by studio heads and directors, but couldn't speak out because she feared her career would end. Brando wrote that listening to these confessions reminded him of his own childhood and that he felt deep empathy for Monroe. Both were people who had transformed their traumas into their art. However, this relationship didn't have just an emotional dimension. In his autobiography, Brando clearly wrote that they also had a physical relationship. "I slept with Marilyn," he said, and added, "but it wasn't what most people think. We had a real connection." Brando's words show the complexity of the relationship, because at that time in Hollywood, everyone was sleeping with everyone, but forming a real connection was rare. What Brando and Monroe found in each other was perhaps something they had never found in their lives: understanding. Monroe's decline. By the early 1960s, Monroe's life was beginning to spiral out of control. Her undisciplined behavior on film sets, constant delays, and memorization problems drove directors crazy. During the filming of Something's Got to Give, Monroe was absent so often that the studio fired her. This was a major blow to Monroe. At the same time, drug and alcohol addiction had reached its peak. Monroe was using sleeping pills, tranquilizers, and painkillers, and the doses were gradually increasing. Her therapist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, knew Monroe had suicidal tendencies and was monitoring her closely, but no one could save her. During this period, Monroe began calling Brando more frequently. In his autobiography, Brando wrote that Monroe would call at night and sometimes couldn't speak because she had overdosed. Brando considered having Monroe hospitalized, but Monroe begged him not to, because if the press found out, her career would be completely over. Brando witnessed this desperation, but there was little he could do. The people around Monroe cared more about her money and fame than her health. Her managers, doctors, and even some friends were exploiting Monroe's condition. The final days. In May 1962, Monroe sang the famous "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" song at President John F. Kennedy's birthday party. Millions who watched that night saw Monroe's sexy and glamorous image, but no one could notice how fragile and unhappy she was. In fact, Monroe was having affairs with both President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy at the time. These relationships were an escape route for Monroe, but they also put her in an even more dangerous situation, because the Kennedys were afraid of Monroe talking. Especially Robert Kennedy was trying to end his relationship with Monroe, but Monroe wouldn't accept it. At this exact point, Monroe called Brando. This phone call isn't mentioned in Brando's autobiography, but his close friends confirmed the conversation took place. Jean Carmen, Monroe's former secretary, said in an interview years later, "Marilyn was very scared a few weeks before her death. She told me, 'I feel like I'm in danger.' She was talking about her relationship with the Kennedys and was afraid they were trying to silence her." Carmen added that Monroe shared these fears with Brando. Did Brando remember what Monroe said in this phone call? According to Carlo Fiore, Brando's close friend, Brando seemed disturbed for days after this phone conversation. Fiore said, "Marlon told me that Marilyn said she was very scared and being followed by someone. Marlon had suggested she leave Los Angeles and come to New York, but Marilyn said she couldn't do that." These statements show how anxious Monroe was before her death, the tragic death. On the night of August 5, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Los Angeles home. The official cause of death was announced as probable suicide from barbiturate overdose. However, there were so many suspicious points surrounding the death that conspiracy theories immediately began to spread. Monroe's housekeeper Eunice Murray gave many contradictory statements about what happened that night. The statements of Dr. Ralph Greenson and Monroe's other doctor, Hyman Engelberg, also contained inconsistencies. FBI files stated that Monroe's phone records mysteriously disappeared, and most importantly, there were witnesses that Robert Kennedy was at Monroe's house that night. When Brando heard the news of Monroe's death, he was completely devastated. Friends said Brando didn't speak for days and shut himself in his house. Brando never accepted Monroe's death as suicide. He reportedly told close friends, "They killed her." But who killed her? The Kennedys? The CIA? Or other forces? Brando didn't know the answers to these questions, but he was certain of one thing. Monroe had dangerous information, and this information killed her. Brando's later years. Years later, in a 1985 BBC documentary, Monroe's death was re-examined. The documentary claimed that Monroe's house was being watched that night, and phone lines were tapped. Some witnesses said they saw Robert Kennedy and two men at Monroe's house that night. Eunice Murray, Monroe's housekeeper, said in an interview before she died, "I didn't tell everything about that night," and added, "I could have gotten in trouble." These statements strengthened the theory that Monroe's death could have been murder. Brando avoided talking about Monroe's death until the end of his life. In his autobiography, he touched on it with just a few sentences and said, "I couldn't save Marilyn." This simple sentence shows how much guilt Brando felt, because Monroe had asked him for help and he couldn't help her. Perhaps if Brando had taken Monroe more seriously in that phone call, if he had convinced her to leave Los Angeles even by force, Monroe might still be alive today. But this is just speculation. The truth was buried with Monroe's death. After Monroe's death, Brando's life also changed. His career continued brilliantly. In 1972, he played Vito Corleone in The Godfather and won his second Oscar. However, he refused to accept the award and sent Native American activist Sachin Littlefeather in his place. This action showed Brando's anger toward the Hollywood system. Brando was no longer just an actor, but also an activist and rebel. However, his private life was chaotic. 3 marriages, countless relationships, and 11 children. Brando never found true peace. In 1990, Brando's son Christian killed his sister Cheyenne's boyfriend Dag Drolet. This incident was a major trauma for Brando. He cried in court defending his son and said, "I'm guilty of being a bad father." Christian received a 10-year prison sentence for manslaughter, but the real blow for Brando was his daughter Cheyenne's suicide in 1995. Cheyenne hanged herself after struggling with depression and mental illness for years. After this event, Brando almost completely withdrew from public life. Brando's final years were spent in loneliness and regrets. Obesity problems reached their peak and his health gradually deteriorated. In 2004, he died from respiratory failure. Before dying, he spoke to some close friends about Monroe and said, "I never forgot her." In Brando's house, there was an old photograph of Monroe. In the photo, Monroe was smiling and looking at Brando. This photograph was proof of how deep the bond between two legends was. Legacy and lessons. The relationship between Brando and Monroe remained one of Hollywood history's most mysterious and tragic stories. Both were seen by the world as gods and goddesses, but in reality, they were fragile people carrying deep wounds. The bond between them was perhaps the only genuine connection either of them found. However, Hollywood's dark world didn't allow them to protect this bond. Monroe's tragic death left a deep mark on Brando's life, and he carried this pain until the end of his days. What can we learn from this story? Perhaps the most important lesson is that fame and success don't bring happiness. Brando and Monroe were the world's most famous people, but both were unhappy. Neither could escape the traumas they experienced in childhood, and these traumas shaped their lives. Additionally, we saw Hollywood's dark side. Studios saw actors as commodities and didn't care about their emotional and physical health. Monroe's death was one of the most tragic consequences of this system. Today, years later, there are still questions about Monroe's death. Did she really commit suicide, or was she murdered? Did Brando know the truth? And most importantly, what did Monroe tell Brando in that final phone call? We may never learn the answers to these questions, because Brando and Monroe took their secrets to their graves. But one thing is certain, the bond between two legends was real, and this bond was something rarely found in Hollywood's fake world. Another passage from Brando's autobiography perfectly summarizes this story. Marilyn wasn't what everyone thought. She was an intelligent, sensitive, and deeply wounded person. Hollywood swallowed and consumed her. I couldn't save her. This is my greatest regret. These words show Brando's love for Monroe and the pain he felt for losing her. Monroe's legacy isn't limited to just her films and iconic images. She is also a symbol of Hollywood's dark side. Monroe showed how much sacrifice is required to achieve success and what price that success has. Brando remained as a reminder of Monroe's story. Both are remembered as cinema history's greatest names,
but they are also remembered as the protagonists of one of the most tragic stories. The relationship between Brando and Monroe continues to fascinate people decades later. It represents the collision of artistic genius with personal tragedy, the price of fame, and the search for authentic human connection in an artificial world. Their story serves as a cautionary tale about the entertainment industry's treatment of its most vulnerable stars, and reminds us that behind every glamorous facade there are real people with real pain. In the end, what remains is not just the mystery of their relationship, or the conspiracy theories surrounding Monroe's death, but rather a poignant reminder of two souls who found brief solace in each other amidst the chaos of Hollywood, a connection that, despite all the barriers and circumstances, was undeniably real and profoundly meaningful to both of them.